Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's Omnibus edition. Ooh, fancy lettering. Anyway, I wanted to make sure that this week we covered a few little things that might not necessarily make the headline news, because there's a lot of stuff always going on that you don't necessarily hear about. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to cover the proposed changes to media, which I found really fascinating, because there are some organizations out there that probably not going to be so keen on this, because it means that they might have to start, being honest, or others that work within a slightly different framework that you would not normally expect media to work within. So there is a whole bunch of really fascinating stuff coming through with those potential changes. But then there's also a lot of weird little indicator things that are coming out as well, like the State of the Nation report from the Salvation Army that said the nation was in quite a state, or the anti-corruption rankings and how we've slipped in that ever so slightly, which is also really fascinating because some of that's long-term, like how we deal with lobbyists in this country. Others are much more recent, like the unparalleled use of urgency to pass things through Parliament really quickly with a really, really short turnaround time around the select committee process. That kind of stuff came up in the report. And there are some MPs who don't want people to realise that. But anyway, make sure that you sit back and enjoy this week's Omnibus. And before that, like, share, subscribe, do all the things that YouTubers ask you to do. While you're watching this one, keep an eye out on the news. I actually tried to do something a little different with this week's news, something that mainstream media doesn't seem to be able to do, which is really fascinating. And that's not a dig at them. I realize that they have a very different job to what I do, and they've got to tell the news stories. But I'll tell you what that is when we get to the other part of this bookend section that I record specifically for the Omnibus. But maybe we should just jump straight into the videos. Let's go watch those. Hello there, kia ora. It looks like the cracks are starting to show in the coalition, created through actions of their own doing and an inability to recognise that. Part of this was actually highlighted on Monday by a stunt that David Seymour tried to pull, driving an 80-year-old Land Rover up the steps of Parliament for a charity event, recreating a drive that the vehicle made in 1948 and being stopped by security with a simple message. The Speaker says no. The Speaker of the House is in charge of what happens on Parliament grounds, whether that's giving permission for someone to get married there, protests on the site, or blasting music at illegal occupiers, and if a politician is allowed to drive up the ceremonial stairs. And the office of the Speaker said no. Now, Seymour defended his actions, and the Prime Minister called it a political sideshow that he has no interest in. After a week of Seymour-induced political sideshows, almost like a whole bunch of distracting things, distracting the public from something which hasn't really made the news as much as a former MP doing her groceries, including the revelation that Seymour wrote a letter of support for murder-accused Philip Polkinghorne, which the Prime Minister on Monday also called ill-advised. And these all came to a head on Monday when two polls were released, showing some bad news for the coalition government. Now, I've said many times before that polls are more about trends, but much better for ratings if taken in isolation, and there is something to be said for matching methodologies from poll to poll as well. And these two polls, well, they both showed the same trend that we've actually seen from every other poll released this year. That continued the trend that we started to see at the end of last year. The coalition is losing support. In fact, for one partner, it's on the verge of not making it back into Parliament. Now, there are some other fascinating little trends in it, like the ACT-aligned taxpayer union Curia polls are the only ones that have ACT support level in double-digit figures. Both Talbot Mills and Varian have New Zealand First on the cusp of dropping below that 5% MMP threshold. 3 of the 4 polls done this year have Te Pāti Māori at close to 6%, and every single one of them has National and Labour neck and neck. And both polls out today, even though the numbers for the support parties differ, have the coalition out on its ear and a left-leaning bloc in power. The 2 polls released today were also done at slightly different times. The Curia poll was done before Waitangi Day, the Varian poll was done before, during and after, and Seymour's antics and Luxon's lack of appearance will have made an impact on these. And we know the Prime Minister knows this because he said so himself. In the post-cabinet briefing on Monday, he said that their internal polling numbers are showing similar results. His reaction? To blame Labour and claim credit for tax relief that didn't offset the rising costs we all face every day, or claim credit for interest rates and inflation drops which were engineered by Treasury when COVID hit. But now they don't have that safety rail against using unemployment as a tool for bringing it down, which National removed as literally the first thing that they did when they got into Parliament, and has partly been behind the fastest levels of unemployment rises we've seen since the John Key era. But even in the midst of the John Key era, National still commanded massive support, and John Key was still an incredibly, weirdly popular Prime Minister. Luxon has never enjoyed that support that Key had, and has always struggled to connect with ordinary New Zealanders. And now, New Zealanders are feeling the pinch, feeling the country is going in the wrong direction, feeling like the focus has not been on dealing with issues important to them, which the polls indicate is the cost of living, which keeps rising, the economy, which is in the midst of the worst recession since 1991, health, which today announced the loss of over 1,000 IT staff members whose jobs are to ensure our digital infrastructure is maintained and accessible. And I'm sure nothing could possibly ever go wrong without that particular infrastructure being looked after properly. Race relations, which are being used by right-wing parties at the moment in particular to stir people up and causing division, which can actually be seen and measured as being exacerbated since the introduction of the Treaty Principles Bill, and unemployment, which is at the worst level it's been since the height of the pandemic. All of this is a pressure cooker for the government, and one which is clearly causing some cracks. It seems our wealthy and sorted Prime Minister was hoping that we'd be talking about other things, like the way they're going to supercharge the economy for the super rich by letting them stay in the country a week a year to be able to get citizenship so that they can invest here, or that there's a special summit for high-profile business leaders and investors heading our way in March. But he gets hounded on the stunts of his coalition partners, and their stunts and stances are clearly pissing off voters and losing those parties' support, which is dragging down the entire coalition's chance of being re-elected, because the majority of us want a working government looking out for us instead of taking pot shots at comedians for asking hard questions lots of people wonder why journalists aren't asking, or fighting against woke banks. And he can't do a thing about it, because there is always the very real risk of one of the partners walking away if they don't get what they want, forcing an early election or making this a lame duck minority government. They have Luxon over a barrel, and he looks like a weak, ineffective leader because of it, whose decisions have made life harder for the average New Zealander. It's a spiral that they caused that leads to what we're seeing happen over and over, which has led to tanking poll numbers, which adds to the pressure cooker that they're in. So it's no wonder that there's cracks showing. Something going to blow is pretty imminent at the moment. And when it comes to getting things back on track, well, when steam trains blow up, it ends up badly for anybody nearby. Hello there, kia ora. While we try and drown out that loud snapping sound of something under a lot of pressure cracking suddenly, news hit on Tuesday that Aotearoa New Zealand had dropped out of the top 3 positions for the World Corruption Perception Index for the first time since the index was started in 1993. This is a measure of how open the government is, based on 13 different international surveys with peer-reviewed results. So, it's not just like someone's opinion. They track transparency and accountability measures from a range of areas to come up with their final rankings. And the reason behind our drop? Well, they're ongoing and they're not being helped by the current government. But to be fair, they're not also entirely the fault of the current government. The biggest issue is actually around lobbying rules. We have some of the weakest rules around lobbying in the entire world, and attempts to tighten them over successive governments hasn't been the strongest. Some lobbyists have swipe card access at the moment to Parliament, and last year Speaker Jerry Brownlee allowed their names to be kept secret, claiming privacy concerns. So we have no real way of knowing exactly who it is that's lobbying at the moment. We also have no stand-down period between being a lobbyist and being an MP. Nicole McKee, Andrew Hoggard, Chris Bishop, they're all former lobbyists who changed career, and Stuart Nash, Kitty Allen, they're all former MPs whose post-government roles include being lobbyists. But there are other markers which have been exacerbated by this government. Issues around donors and policy changes, immigrant exploitation law changes, and increased use of urgency in Parliament to circumvent the democratic process and undermine the judicial process are all included in the latest report as reasons for the ranking drop. And that's not likely to change anytime soon. The processes this government has decided to use and the laws that they've changed or rushed, they're not going to alter them because of an international report. In fact, this government has shown that evidence-based decision-making isn't really a concern or strong point of theirs. And there are some parts of the coalition that are more averse to facts and evidence than others, and there's another part of the coalition that's much more averse to honesty.
News investigated and found organisers told Seymour not once,
we've been told to keep off the slopes,
but twice,
we've been told by security that we cannot go on the slopes.
and he still hit the gas.
They said that these guys can't, but I said, well, what are they going to do? Bring me before Privileges Committee for driving a Land Rover?
But the risks of a lack of transparency in our government and the way it works is a problem. The public losing faith in the instruments and institutions of governance means that we see a disengagement level increase. We see a bigger risk of losing social cohesion as social ability changes for the government to do its job. And these become even more problematic in times of crisis, when people really rely on those structures in times of need. So what may seem like a small story is actually a sign of a bigger issue, and one that could get worse if left unchecked. When the next election rolls around, it's important to make sure that we know how parties vying for our votes intend to ensure the trust in our systems are restored and the processes are as transparent as possible. And we definitely need to start looking at ways to make sure those standards and the way that they look to the outside world are tightened for everyone's sake. Hello there, kia ora. Did you know that the government is currently looking at revamping how media works here in Aotearoa with a range of discussion documents with an aim on how to revive the media industry? Now, this is just at the discussion and early select committee feedback phase, and no changes that they would agree to would come into play until 2026, and it's a lot of, well, slight readjustments, but it's a start. Some of the suggestions include making it compulsory to put New Zealand-based media outlet streaming services on smart TVs in a prominent place, making sure streaming services invest in local production, highlight local content. There's talk of combining New Zealand On Air and the New Zealand Film Commission, two standalone media funding bodies at the moment, and putting them into one big organisation, allowing advertising on holidays and more captioning and audio description options. And the government does admit that these are fiddling around the edges, little changes to adapt to the changing ways that audiences now interact with media. But there are some wider reaching changes as well, which could change how media works here, like an update on the broadcasting standards rules to apply to a wider range of content, anything considered professionally produced. Our rules are actually kind of out of date. They were written in the 80s for radio and television, and rules like how news is researched and presented accurately, how misleading audiences is treated, and how shows and content are categorized all fall into that, which would directly impact content like the platform and reality check radio, and depending on how they define professional, could mean content creators who go out of their way to misrepresent, cause harm, or stir up dissent would then be subject to these new rules as part of a wider approach to rebuild trust in media. And trust in the media is something that they're focusing on. They're considering the impact of falling trust levels in media overseas and its impact here on revenue and audience numbers, and wanting to see institutions like Radio NZ or TV NZ go even further in the steps that they've taken already to try and rebuild trust from audiences. They also acknowledge that right-wing parties keep hearing how mainstream media is just a bunch of lefty shills, sometimes from the Deputy Prime Minister himself, and almost always from people who have no idea how to actually recognise media bias and instead don't see how their far-right views aren't more accepted by people or given airtime by organisations that have to legally present facts that they can back up and confirm. Not that a coalition MP would say that last part out loud, because they'd lose a big chunk of their voters. Now, it should be noted that this isn't a replacement for the Fair News digital bargaining bill that would make big tech companies pay for locally produced news content that they use, which is being put on hold while the government takes stock of the industry and also sees what's happening with the Australian version of that legislation. And these are just discussions at the moment, and that's important because there are some levers that the government could pull to help with some of those goals, like trust in online content, which could be better managed if an organisation like NetSafe had better abilities to remove misleading or harmful content, which often misrepresents information to achieve its goal. Unfortunately for this government, though, those kind of changes wouldn't stop embarrassing headlines. For that, you'd need to get rid of embarrassing politicians, and for that to happen, Well, they're the ones running the country at the moment, so that's not going to happen. Hello there, kia ora. This week, the Salvation Army released its annual State of the Nation report, and it ain't good. It points out that there are a few areas that they can improve on because of a lack of resources, and that the indicators are showing that things out there are worsening. It also debunks a few claims that we hear from politicians who like to pick and choose their facts, like, yes, social housing builds continue, and thanks to the effort of the last Labour government, there are more of them being made available today than there was a year ago. But the pace in which they're building is still well below the needs that we have for our growing population. It shows food insecurity has risen, especially amongst families with children, as has assaults and neglect cases with children involved. And these are the result of a range of other factors, like 400,000 people needing welfare support in an environment where people are punished for being on welfare by the government. That meth use has doubled, dangerous drinking and gambling has increased, which are indicators of high stress times for people. The KiwiSaver hardship withdrawals are up 58% on last year, that roughly 1 in 3 people have been a victim of a violent crime, and that 40% of communities have high rental unaffordability. And there's cultural issues being highlighted as well. A decline in the number of people who feel it's easy to express their identity as Māori. Re-imprisonment rates and imprisonment rates for Māori in particular are rising, and Māori and Pacifica workers are more likely to be made unemployed by a rate of 2 to 3 times that of other population groups. It's depressing reading, and it's even more depressing that it's not that much of a surprise. When sanctions were reinforced, experts said that the result was going to be more family harm and kids would bear the brunt of it. Experts in addiction pointed out that increased costs of living stresses and insecurity around employment and housing lead to a spike in drug, alcohol, and gambling issues. When the government scrapped Section 27 cultural reports as part of the legal aid system, they were told that this would disproportionately impact Māori and Pacifica peoples when it came to imprisonment numbers. Hell, Paul Goldsmith even admitted that they knew that. And fair pay agreement legislation, which was scrapped under the 100 Days of Urgency policy bonfire, was designed to help ensure that one group over another didn't get overburdened in the statistics of who was most likely to be made unemployed. Even the Treasury mandate to ensure inflation wasn't reined in by mass unemployment levels was removed, despite warnings of how much it would impact people directly. And want to make people feel less able to express their identity as Māori, then scream about department name changes and road signs, remove and attack treaty provisions in legislation, attack tools put in place to help achieve equitable outcomes, then introduce the Treaty Principles Bill and let politicians, commentators and lobby groups conflate race with culture, nationality and identity for months. And it's not like voters and politicians weren't warned. Hell, I know I covered it and so did a lot of other people. But voters wanted change and voters got it. Only someone cruel and heartless, though, would think that the outcomes of all of this were the best possible outcomes. But there are some glimmers of hope. This government has shown it will sometimes, occasionally, reconsider if the public is vocal enough. We saw that with the latest Road of Significance project that they announced. It's vital if we want to see positive change based on evidence and data, then we need to make ourselves heard and make sure that you're letting the people know that are around you just how much their vote can impact you and others. Because the outcomes that we've seen from ignoring data, evidence, and research, well, eventually it's going to impact all of us. Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's The News. In the High Court this week, Ngāi Tahu has been arguing that the Crown has left the state of freshwater in the South Island in a terrible state, and it needs to recognise tino rangatira over freshwater for the iwi. The tribe's lawyer is former Treaty Negotiations Minister Chris Finlayson, KC, who, as part of the John Key National Party-led government whose relaxed attitude to water care and pandering to farmers contributed to the state of the waterways, says, "Now I'm out of government, I can be honest, we done fucked up." International men's fashion expert Derek Guy has questioned the taste levels of Prime Minister Christopher Luxon after he made a social media video promoting New Zealand Lamb Day in a t-shirt over top of his suit jacket. There is a bit of history of prime ministers being tied up with fashion, like when John Key decided to wear whatever this was, and Helen Clark and Jacinda Ardern walked the world of wearable art stage, but this is the first time any of them has been called out by the fashion police. In response, the Prime Minister has said, though, that this counts towards their target of 500 new police officers by at least one. A new report from the Salvation Army has highlighted that 400,000 people, or 12% of the population last year, applied for additional help from MSD and peripheral organisations amidst a worsening cost of living crisis driven by economic, climate and recession. The report also found that violence and neglect impacting children had increased and that overall violent crime had increased, although young offender crime had continued a downward trend that spanned the past decade. They called for a fairer safety net social welfare system and a way to lower rents, said the Prime Minister. Seen here taking someone else's job for a laugh, they should just pull up their bootstraps and go door knocking. I'm wealthy and sorted, it's not my problem. The saviour of the economy, the recently announced digital nomad visa, has not seen an increase in visa applications, according to Immigration New Zealand. In fact, it seems to have had the opposite effect. An extra 50,000 views to the corresponding websites were recorded in the first 2 weeks after the new visa was announced, but fewer than 24,000 applications have been received for all visa categories, said Immigration Minister Erica Stanford, seen here calling for an end to the trade blockade around the planet Naboo. We're still working out why no one wants to visit and work here with our historic unemployment, blatant racism, degrading health and education systems, failing infrastructure, and the worst recession since the early 90s. But I'm sure we'll cancel something Māori soon and use the funds to come up with a solution. 7 months after a special election in Tauranga, it's been revealed that new mayor and former Olympian Mahi Drysdale, seen here wishing he was still on the water and not dealing with the insanity of the most extreme Tauranga locals, still hasn't moved to Tauranga, instead commuting from Cambridge for work. Said Tauranga's most vocal online commentators, well, at least he's not like that lazy Maori councillor who had to quit due to ongoing health concerns. In Tamaki Makaurau, overnight tests on the new rail lines were deemed successful, bringing new transport hubs to busy areas one step closer to fruition. Said Mayor Wayne Brown, "See, Christopher, this is how you get things back on track. Now, all I need to do is find out where this Karanga happy place is. I wonder if it's near K Road somewhere." Southland MP Joseph Mooney, seen here preparing to abandon the sinking ship known as the National Party, was this week caught out accidentally sending a text to Carmel Sepuloni, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, complaining about the ACT Party, saying it's funny that ACT never defend their policies in hearings and never ask questions. In a faux pas likely to be mentioned many times in the future, showing widening cracks in the coalition. When asked for comment, an ACT spokesperson said, "We're not going to defend that and we have no questions. Now do as we say or we'll rip the country to shreds." Serial bitcher Julian Batchelor, seen here looking for his white privilege and not being able to find it despite everyone else telling him where it is and that it's really obvious, made an appearance this week at the Treaty Principles Bill Select Committee hearing where he claimed that God spoke to him on a beach and told him to start a ministry. No, sorry, that's what he said about his failed evangelical church. He held a sign there that read, "Homosexuality is a thing that God hates." No, wait, sorry, that was his protest against the Hero Parade in the 90s, and last year he said his views still stand strong on that particular issue. Oh. He said immigrants should go home. No, sorry, that was from his 2005 run as a New Zealand First candidate against Helen Clark. Maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't be listening to anything this person has to say, and just everyone around him should ignore him completely. It was revealed in Parliament this week that 8 out of 10 youth offenders who took part in the same but different boot camp have re-offended and are now back in youth justice facilities. At the time of the launch, Karen Chow, Children's Minister, claimed that the new camps were different to the ones run under the previous national government. Technically, she's not wrong. The success rate for this camp sits at a meagre 10% after the tragic death of one of the attendees, whereas John Key's boot camps had a success rate of 47%. The New Zealand English Teachers Association has exited the Ministry of Education curriculum rewrite process, citing a shambolic process too focused on getting what the course writers want in, no matter how much of a cognitive overload it would cause students, or the impossible to achieve workload it would force teachers to undertake. The new curriculum came under fire last year when it was revealed it was being guided by regular disinformation media outlet guest Dr. Elizabeth Rata, seen here sucking up to the MP who gave her a job to rewrite the curriculum by supporting the Treaty Principles Bill, was determined to include the collections of Shakespeare and Beowulf into the programme and include cursive writing, and expected she would have final say on the curriculum over the ministry itself, revealed in leaks to RNZ last year. So the fact that uppity teachers think that they know better is clearly not possible. Wellington Mayor Tory Whānau, seen here with a mini version of the Gatekeeper or the Keymaster from Ghostbusters, this week unveiled plans for a revamped Golden Mile project within the city's central business district. The new plan creates more space for outdoor eating, public seating, self-sufficient green areas that filter rainwater before returning it to the harbour, and alternative transport use options. But for balance, the Post decided the best person to talk to was the person who came second in a by-election last year campaigning against the changes, who shockingly did not like the changes, and it wasn't disclosed that they were a candidate who ran against these changes in the election, instead demanding more money be spent on fixing pipes, despite a 300% budget increase to water infrastructure projects in the last 3 years within the city. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon, seen here playing cricket, a sport you can't score against yourself in, scored an own goal in the House this week when opposition made calls to fire David Seymour from ministerial positions after he wrote a letter of support for Philip Polkinghorne after he had complained that MPs shouldn't interfere in judicial decisions, and he responded with a list of Labour MPs that were fired from ministerial positions as examples of MPs not fired. Of course, this isn't really much of a surprise, since Luxon clearly feels the only sort of MPs who should be punished for not doing their job are women, or lefties. MP Shane Jones, seen here explaining to the waiter how big a pile of free food he wants from the meal that's being paid for by lobbyists, has criticised Te Pāti Māori MP Takuta Ferris for not delivering an apology in the House in English. Ferris was recently found to have called MPs known for not telling the truth liars in the House, which is against the rules for Parliament, and as a result was asked to apologise. Ferris delivered his apology in Te Reo Māori, which as an officially recognised language is permitted, but Jones felt the apology should be in English, which it does not have to be. Jones felt it was important everyone could see and understand what was being said, while Ferris said in a response, "Te rau mātua Shane, how about taking that approach to cameras on fishing ships?" And finally, the Minister of Internal Affairs, Brooke Van Velden, has used Valentine's Day to release marriage statistics for 2024. More than 20,000 marriages were registered last year, with almost half of those being people in their 30s, and 740 of those people being over 70. Since New Zealand records began in 1848, there's been 12,272 people who have chosen to make Valentine's Day their wedding day. Said Van Velden, "See, even I can acknowledge that you humans have a need for an emotion you call love." And that is this week's The News. Hey, thanks again for checking out this week's Omnibus and for making it all the way through. Unless you skipped all the way to the end because you watched everything during the week and you just wanted to know what I did to the news that was slightly different. Well, I wanted a news section that didn't focus on David Seymour. I noticed the last couple of weeks that we've done this, David Seymour has taken up a lot of oxygen, and he does so on mainstream media. He's done that very well over the last couple of weeks. It's almost like he's trying to distract the public from something really bad that his party has been aligned with. I have no idea what that could be. Jargo? I mean, do you? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this week's Omnibus, and as I said before, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. If you want to become a paid member, you can. It's super easy. You get to see all this stuff in advance that way, and you get fun little emojis like, twerking David Seymour, if you really want to use it. Anyway, until next week, make sure you live long, prosper, be one with the Force, and I will catch you guys all next time. Ka kite anō. Is it secret? Is it safe?